So what we find is that heterogeneity, which is my more neutral term, or you could perhaps say the more neutral term for diversity in biology, at least that's my perspective, in the sense that it just means differences in type or variation across individuals. It can mean either. So we treat it for now as a synonym to diversity. And we come back to that distinction at the end of the talk. What we find is that heterogeneity in strategy use is potentially quite important to the emergence of collective patterns, like the distribution of fight sizes. But the first thing that we need to be able to do is quantify heterogeneity in strategy. Before we can ask any question about why diversity of strategy matters, we need to be able to quantitatively say how many strategies there are. So much of this part of my talk will be about how one can do that on social data. So remember, the goal here is going to be how can we extract strategies from data? Okay? Can anyone tell me where strategy, what framework is typically used to address the question of strategy? What do you associate the word strategy with? Does anyone know?
Game theory?
Exactly, yes, game theory. So typically, we study strategy in game theory. Game theory is very useful. It's a modeling framework, a sort of way of thinking about a problem that is very good for understanding strategy when you have two players, two individuals, like these two pairs, jackrabbits, fighting, for example, or cooperating. As you know, game theory is basically comprised of what we might call simple or elegant equilibrium models. Typically, and this is, I think, a big deficiency of game theory, it's weakly tied to data. So really what people are doing who make game theory models are making toy models or designing mathematical thought experiments to think through why a problem like the evolution of cooperation might be hard. The payoffs, and this point relates very much to this point, and strategies are positive. What that means is that they're not given by the data or what we know about the real world. They're, in some sense, made up or assumed when we build the model. They're conditions under which the model works. Typically, in a game theoretic model, the interaction structure is pairwise. So again, good for these kinds of interactions, and higher order interactions are neglected. What do I mean by that? I mean that if David and Pablo and I had a fight, and then one of you got involved, that would be much harder to study with standard game theoretic modeling framework, because it's a hard problem mathematically. And the goal is typically to identify unevadable strategies given assumptions about payoffs. And typically, we build our model with a small number of fixed or idealized strategies. Now, so my colleagues and I can't really use game theory to understand the complicated systems that we study because there are many individuals interacting at once, and so it doesn't fit into this nice dyadic or pairwise context. So we have been designing what we call inductive game theory, where the strategies used by individuals and their consequences for conflict dynamics are derived computationally or extracted from highly resolved time series, like the one I showed you a minute ago, on competitive processes. So what inductive game theory does is provide a way of quantifying the space or diversity of the strategy set and its implications for collective dynamics. So here's a typical game theory representation of a cooperation problem, of like the prisoner's dilemma. And the important point is that the strategies individuals play typically depend critically on the payoffs that we assume. Okay? In contrast, in inductive game theory, what matters is just the observation of behavior. So we're going to extract from a series of behavioral events the strategies or decision rules that individuals use. So again, here's the sort of contrast between the frameworks, inductive, deductive, or canonical regular game theory, very good for pairwise interactions. Thought experiment, inductive game theory, good for multiplayer, multi-individual scenarios, and good for drawing conclusions from the data itself. So these are not thought experiments. So here's the contrast. And I should emphasize that inductive game theory in no sense is meant to replace regular game theory. They're complementary. In fact, what you might argue is that inductive game theory can give us a better sense of what the payoffs and strategies should be that go into our game theory thought experiments.
Can I add a point?
Of course, yeah.
I mean, just one point. One of the primary goals of regular game theory is to explore the stability of equilibrium. And so there's Nash and so on. In inductive game theory, we drop the equilibrium assumption. So you're no longer necessarily studying systems in equilibrium. And that's key to the analysis of game theory.
But it's not clear that some of the systems that we study, that we have in the real world, are in equilibrium.
So would that pose an analytical tractability problem?
I can't hear you.
Would that kind of reduce the analytical tractability of the problem if you don't have a kind of equilibrium?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we don't, in fact, this is because we're calling it inductive game theory, but we don't yet have a theory.
Okay.
We have a series of methods
So
that we're talking about for identifying strategies, but we're trying to work out what the theory is. Whereas game theory is actually, in some sense, axiomatic.
Yeah.
This is not.
There's more phenomenological.
Although it's much more empirical. Game
Yes,
theory-
not phenomenological. I
Yeah.
wouldn't say it's phenomenological.
So game theory grew out of maths. Inductive game theory grows out of observation. So
But, and it might be that if we ever, make our way toward our axiomatic theory of inductive game theory, that it won't be equilibrium. But perhaps it will be. We don't know.
But what you mean is that you can't really assess if you are in front of an ESS strategy that's with inductive game theory.
Well, I'm not sure that you can't. We haven't. And we don't know if that's even relevant. Yes. If this concept of an ESS is going to be relevant in this case. We don't know.
But you can, in any case, assess if you are in front of a like locally stable strategy, or you haven't.
In this, in this sense, and you jump in the sense that we could show that a strategy persists over a long period of time. And that might suggest that it's stable. But that's right now as far as we can go in terms of stability. So we can look at the evolution, how strategies change through time, whether there's changing because the opportunity to use them is changing, so the distribution of opportunities has shifted, or whether they're changing because individuals are learning to use the strategies more efficiently, and then whether it sort of asymptotes out and stabilizes, whether we don't see actually over a reasonable period of time any change. So we can do that, and we are working on that. David, do you want to add something?
Yeah, no, but it's interesting that from a mathematical point of view, it's natural to ask these questions about stability. But from the empirical point of view, what are you explaining? And our sense is that, first of all, these models are never tested on data, or very simple data. And moreover, that might be fundamentally the wrong stability requirements, might be the fundamentally wrong solution concept for real-world games. Natural games, it may be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, another way of putting it is that I guess we are interested in the stability concept because it tells us what strategies are unavailable, right? So, but it might be that conditions change very often, and the stability concept is not really relevant, and what we're actually more interested in is the transient dynamics. Okay. So how do we do this? How do we extract strategies from the data? So what are the data? So again, here's this fight. So this is a typical fight, and you notice that there are 3 individuals involved in the fight. So we can represent, again, the conflict time series simply like this, where we have fights separated by peaceful periods when there is no fighting occurring in the group. And we have multiple time series that we collect over observation days like this. So we have we have one of these for each observation day, and then we aggregate the data. And the statistical property that we are going to ask in this talk is, can we extract decision rules, and can those decision rules be used to reconstruct this pattern, this distribution of fight sizes? So can we extract the decision rules at the individual level and recreate a collective pattern that we observe in the data? This collective pattern. So what do the data actually look like schematically? So here's the structure of the data. Oops. Okay. Here's the structure. So the data we actually have are who did what to whom. So what, say, David did to me in fight at time step 1, what Pablo did in time step 2, and so forth. We have the number of individuals involved in every fight, and we have information about their behavior in the fight. The information that we're going to include in our analysis is only the information about who participated in each fight. Okay? So not what they did to each other, but just that they were present in a fight.
Why did you choose the size of the fight? Why?
Why did we choose to focus on?
I was thinking about it interesting as a learning process when you are not fighting, because that's the moment where you are processing the information about how the government is fighting.
So,
or a difference between fighting and not fighting, something like that.
so when the animals are not fighting, they're engaged in other behaviors, like grooming and sitting in contact and foraging. And there is information in that time series about the conflict time series. So one question, I'm not sure if this is where you're going, is what the relationship is between the behaviors that go on during the peaceful period and the behaviors that go on during the fight period. But is that your question?
No, I was just thinking, I don't understand exactly what is that burden on the size of the fight.
Okay.
If I don't want to be...
So what the statistical pattern we're asking about is the distribution of fight sizes. We're asking, and if you're asking why is that an interesting statistical pattern? Who cares about the distribution of fight sizes? What implications does it have for individuals? If that's your question, we will come to that. It does have serious implications for individuals. We can measure that, but I don't want to jump ahead yet. Okay, yes?
In that graph, you have more information than just which monkey participated in the fight. You also have which fight with which one else.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
So we have that information, but we're not going to use it in our analysis. We're going to start simply. We might eventually get to that. So that what you're asking about is what we would call the intra-fight dynamics. So what we're going to do is ask whether, by looking at correlations across fights and who participates, can we reconstruct the distribution of fight sizes? I'll explain that in more detail in a second.
What's
Yeah.
the difference between the colors? You have like two types of...
So additional information that we have. So we have quite a bit, a very rich data set. So we have information about who did what to whom, what their properties are, so their age and their sex, and so the colors simply represent variation in individual properties. So the point of the slide is just to illustrate that we're reducing, or the amount of information we're considering is small. There is much more we could ask about this data set. But we need to start simply, and you'll see that it's actually computationally, even working just with this amount of data is computationally quite intensive. Okay. So to reduce the data structure, we reduce the data structure essentially to this, where we just know who participated in each fight. And by the way, when you participate in a fight, you are not necessarily an aggressor, and you're not necessarily receiving aggression. You could participate passively, just approach the fight and watch what's going on, or you could calm somebody down. All of those individuals are considered fight participants. So we don't make any, we're not going to use any information about their role in the fight at this point. Okay. And what we're going to ask about are correlations across conflicts in co-occurrence. So does my occurrence in a fight at time step 1 predict David's occurrence in a fight at time step 2? And the logic here is that monkeys are subject to processes like emotional contagion. And so if their friends are involved in fights, they get agitated and they're more likely to be involved in fights as well. And just a little caveat, a little aside, in much work on social evolution, the assumption is that most fights are over immediate access to resources. So they're directly over competition for resources. What we're asking here, are these fights, is the reason why you join a fight based on memory for who was in the previous fight. So in other words, the implication of that would be that the competition is long time scale, not immediate. Long time scale, so you're competing for dominance and power by virtue of supporting and retaliating against your allies and competitors. All right? So that's important. So, you know, if you are sort of standard social evolution guy, you might think that this isn't going to work because all fights are over some immediate access to a resource. Okay. So we start with the very simplest correlations that we might imagine that could exist in this system. The simplest is the pairwise correlation, and that simply means A in fight at time t in fight t predicts B in fight t plus 1. Okay? And then there are two other simple correlations. They're both triadic. So A and B at fight t predict C at fight t plus 1. So note this isn't real time. This is fight. And finally, we might ask this other whether there is evidence for this other triadic correlation in the data. A fight at time t predicts individuals B and C at t plus 1. A in fight t predicts B and C at t plus 1. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our time series and ask whether there is any significant evidence for these correlations, statistical evidence. And of course, the correlations can be positive or negative. And by that I mean my presence in a fight at T1, at time step 1, can inhibit David's presence in the next fight or stimulate it. Okay. All right, so what we do in order to determine whether these correlations are significant is we test them against a null model. A null model. So we have null models for each type of correlation, and we ask whether we observe a correlation above and beyond, that's above and beyond the null expectation. And if we do, we say that there is a significant correlation between, say, me and David predicting Pablo. All right? And we call these significant correlations delta P's. Just doesn't mean anything in particular, they're just delta P's. Okay. So what we get when we extract the delta P's for the pairwise correlation, A goes to B, is a simple directed graph if we consider all of the pairwise correlations that we find evidence for in the data. And for the triadic correlations, we get directed bipartite graphs. And you'll see what I mean by that in just a minute. Okay. And again, the edges will be stimulating or generative or inhibitive, depending on whether the associated delta P is positive or negative, in the sense that I just described. Okay, so here's the simple directed correlation network supported by the data. So these are all the edges that we pulled out of the data, the significant delta P's for the pairwise correlations. So what this is not a causal network yet, but it's a correlation network. And I have one for one of the triadic, I have one graph for one of the triadic correlations, and that's shown here. And it's a subset of the full graph, it's actually quite large. And it just shows you, so here we have, let's go back. So on this slide we have this animal, Princess is her name, and the arrow coming from TA, which is Taurus, the male, says that Taurus predicts Princess occurring at the next time step. Okay? And Hurrah, this animal here, predicts Princess occurring at the next time step. Yes?
What's significant delta P?
A significant delta P
More than
is, so you can go look into,
0.05? It's, you said the threshold?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
You said the threshold for the significant delta P arbitrary?
The which?
Like,
The threshold?
yeah,
The what?
The threshold?
The threshold.
yeah.
Yes, sorry, yes, that's correct. So the threshold comes from the null model. So let's say you occur once, you predict me once in the data. Like you occur and then I occur after you.
But wait,
But only one time.
delta P comes from the null model.
The threshold comes
thresholds
from the null
also.
model.
Ah,
Okay, and then the significant correlations, the ones that are above the null model, we call delta P's.
In this case, what means those arrows that come from the same individual goes to?
It means it predicts itself. So, it's likely to occur in 2 fights instead of just one if it occurred at all. Okay, and so the dashed lines are inhibitory. So, for example, Libby, this animal, inhibits echo in the next fight. Significantly inhibits echo. So this is the triadic version of the network, the triadic correlation. And what we have here are Fortune and Flapper occur in a fight, Fortune and Flapper, and then they predict Flapper occurs in the next fight. So that's what it means in this network. So this is, again, a correlation network for the triadic predictions. And it's a subset of the full graph. Okay. So what we want to do is ask, are these correlations actually causal? Are they actually producing the time series that we observe? So we want what we call a minimal model of conflict decision making. We want to rewrite the correlation as a space of hypothesized causal models. So to do that, all we're going to do is simply say AB is no longer a correlation, but it's a causal hypothesis. And we're going to represent that as C11 for the pairwise, and C21 for the triadic of this form, and C12 for the triadic of this form. Is the relationship of 1-1, 2-1, and 1-2 clear to everybody? Okay, good. So the more general version of this is what we call CNN. So groups of M individuals decide what to do at time step T plus 1 based on the appearance of groups of N individuals in the previous fight. Right? As N and M increase, we say the cognitive and coordination burden increase. And I'll come back to that in a second. Okay. So to summarize, so we're treating significant correlations as hypotheses corresponding to alternative causal decision-making rules or strategies. And as you'll see, we think they have different computational requirements. So to summarize, the 3 causal rules or decision rules or strategies that we're considering are these. Now notice C11 is pairwise. That's the memory requirement. So that means all I have to remember about the previous fight is that David participated in it. Okay? That's why it's pairwise. And we say there's no coordination because in the second time step, I don't have to respond with Pablo to David for C11. I only have to respond myself. Whereas for C21, I have to remember that David and Pablo occurred in the previous fight. So the memory is for a triadic relationship, me in relationship to a pair of others. But there is no coordination requirement because, again, I'm simply responding to the 2 of them, not with anybody else. In contrast, C12, the response in the second time step has to be joint. So me and Pablo jointly respond or coordinate in some sense to the presence of David in the previous time step. The memory for C12 is also triadic, should be obvious. Okay. Now I have to tell you one more thing before we can discuss how we actually test whether these are causal. And that is, how do we resolve contradicting messages in these multiplayer interactions? So let's say you have a group of monkeys fighting. There's more than 3 or 4 animals fighting, or simply more than 2, you have a problem. What we need is something that we call a combinator. So consider the C21 strategy space. Let's say that delta P is positive. That means the probability that AB tells C to join the next fight. Right? Forget about the negative one. Don't worry about that. In many fights, there are more individuals than just A and B. What if DE is also involved in the fight, D and E, and tells C to avoid the fight? So A and B are saying C join, and D and E are basically saying stay away. What does C do? How does C choose between the recommendations, the so-called recommendations, of A and B, or C and D, D and E? So we introduce this binary combinator, an OR and an AND version. And the OR says, if everyone in the fight says join, I join. If one animal in the fight says join, you join. Doesn't matter if anybody else, if the other recommendations are conflicting. You join based on one recommendation. And says that everybody in the fight must say join before you join. Okay? Now obviously there's a lot of space between these two, and in a more elaborate treatment we could consider that. But for now we're just going to consider the binary case. Right? So we say that OR is effectively conflict prone. It means you're easily pushed into conflict. And AND is conflict averse. So you're very unlikely to fight unless everyone is saying, yes, you should fight. Everyone in the previous conflict. So effectively our space, our model is now C and M plus AND or OR. So 3 parameters. And don't worry about this, but this just summarizes the different components of the model, the causal models. Okay? We've been through this before. Now you can represent this space of what we call Markovian strategies in a lattice. And I should have pointed out earlier that what we are considering here is one time lag. So fights separated by only one peaceful period. You can extend this to fights that are separated by 2 or more peaceful periods simply by extending C and M, for example, to C and MP, where P would be the 3rd fight. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's much more computationally intensive. So the strategy space for C and M looks something like this. And of course, we could enumerate many C and M's. We could keep building this lattice down, right? And how do we restrict the C and M's that we consider? This is a real problem, right? We could just build simulations in which we ask, can we recover the distribution of fight sizes and try everything? We don't want to do that. So what we do is we restrict the space of these C and M's to ones that we think are cognitively parsimonious, cognitively principled, based on the cognition of our animals. And that's why we limit ourselves to those 3 structures at the top, to the 3 correlations that we started with. Because we know the animals can make those kinds of assessments. They can remember triads, they can remember pairs. Okay? So we're just going to consider these. So another way of thinking about this lattice is that as you increase M, the coordination burden goes up. So the animals, and obviously there are spatial constraints that will make coordinating with a large group of individuals unlikely, or increasingly unlikely. And as N goes up, the memory component increases. So you can think of this as this kind of computational lattice that's based on coordination and memory. And that defines the space of strategies that you consider given the cognition of your components, of your individuals. All right.
Excuse me, the memory, it's about past fights?
Yeah.
Like several past fights?
Just one.
Just one.
So we're only considering one time lag, so one fight followed, two fights interrupted by one peaceful period.
Yeah, so where's the memory?
So the memory is for individuals. So remember,
Okay.
yeah, you're remembering